Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm speaking with Courtney Crosby. Courtney is a doctoral candidate from the University of Texas at Austin. She has her bachelor's in psychology from the same school, her master's in psychology from the same school, and is slated to finish her degree or PhD in evolutionary psychology early this coming year. In this conversation, we talk about much of her research, which is in evolutionary psychology and specifically on disgust and sexual disgust. I've been wanting to talk to her for a long time. She does great work on disgust research with David Buss, and so I really wanted to talk to her about this very specific aspect of her research. We start the conversation by talking about her background and how she became interested in evolutionary psychology and studying sexual disgust. For the first half of the conversation, I would say we talk about disgust overall and in general as an emotion. So we really try to lay the groundwork for what disgust is, how it works as a emotional system, and then we talk about sex and detailing, what sex is, and then we finally get to sexual disgust kind of towards the back half of the conversation. So kind of the long route, but I wanted to do that intentionally with her because she's just really good at this stuff, and I thought that would be much better for people to kind of understand, where this sits within the world instead of just going right into the research. So we start by talking about where disgust fits in with other emotions. We give a definition of disgust and how we make the distinction from distaste. We talk about the different elements of core disgust, such as pathogen avoidance, etc. We talk about some of the associations between disgust and norms, judgments, attributions. We talk about disgust as a system. And then we transition the conversation into talking about sex. We talk about kind of some of the definitions and the boundaries and limits of what sex is and isn't. And then we spend part of the conversation talking about this, I don't want to say debate, but this kind of discussion that's going on about differences between sexual desire and sexual arousal. And I'll be honest, I hadn't really thought about this or seen them as distinct. And so we have a nice exchange, kind of a back and forth about what that is, kind of sort of, brainstorming or thinking out loud about, well, what about this or what about this, which is always fun to do. And she was great for that. We also talk about the difference between sexual desire, mental arousal. She describes some of the tools used in her sexual disgust research, which was really, really interesting. And then we talk about sexual disgust formally. She talks about her 6 dimensions of sexual disgust. There's a paper she did on this. Some of the cross-cultural findings on disgust. And then we talk a little bit about moral disgust towards the end. I think in total, this was almost 3 hours. I trimmed it a little bit just because there were some kind of sidebar conversations or rabbit trails that were kind of sort of off topic, so I trimmed it a little bit, but even still I think this is well over 2 or maybe 2.5 hours. And so I look at some of these conversations as kind of a place and time, right? For anybody, myself or listeners, to go back and say, I want to listen to something on disgust, this emotion, and how can I go back and listen to something and get a really good, healthy overview and some significant details. And so that's how I treated this conversation. And, I'm so happy that, Courtney came on. She was super generous with her time, her brilliance, and just her energy. And she was, raring to go. She was really, really enthusiastic and just a really awesome person. And so now I bring you Courtney Crosby. I'm here with Courtney Crosby. Courtney, I'm very excited. I've been looking forward to talking to you all week. Get to talk about your research, talk about yourself, all the wonderful things you're doing. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here as someone who listens to your podcast quite regularly.
You're much too kind. Much too kind. I appreciate that. Okay, so a lot of people may not know who you are. Some people will. So just kind of give us the brief snapshot of who you are, just kind of your overview, like who, what you do, what you research, and anything you're currently working on, etc.
Great. Yeah, so I'm a fifth-year graduate student at the University of Texas. I work with David Buss and Cindy Meston. I'm actually the only graduate student they've ever co-mentored together, which has been
cool.
Interesting. Yeah.
Very nice.
And my research really focuses on studying aspects of men and women's sexuality from an evolutionary perspective. More specifically, which we'll get into, I study individual differences in sexual disgust. And I've also done some work with, inducing sexual arousal. How does that impact risk-taking behaviors for men and women? And my dissertation will focus on sexual morality and the link between religion and sexual morality.
Interesting.
Yeah, a little bit of everything.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, there's lots to talk about then. Okay, so maybe just tell us a little bit if you want to share a little bit about your bio. How did you, your research interests are obviously super interesting, and so people don't just kind of walk into that or stumble into sexual differences or sexual disgust and morality and all that stuff. So just tell us how you got involved into evolutionary psych and at University of Texas, and just kind of how that was formulating for you and kind of up to where you're at now.
Yeah, so it's actually quite an interesting story. So I grew up in Texas, about an hour north of Austin, where I currently live. And not surprisingly, did not learn much about sex or evolution. And so I go to UT, first gen, very excited to learn more. Psychology was really interesting to me. And I was volunteering at this event. So I started getting involved in these student organizations, as one does as an undergrad. And I go to this thing that UT has called Hot Science Cool Talks. And these talks actually, they happen all the time, not during COVID, obviously, but they bring in different scientists from different fields and they give an hour and a half talk or so on their research. And it's open to the public. It's really cool. A lot of high school students from the greater Austin area come. And this particular event that I was at happened to be by David Buss, my current advisor, on evolutionary psychology, which I had never heard about up until that point. And so I go to the talk, I'm listening to it, and I'm not kidding, I'm actually mind blown. And it starts to make sense of a lot of things that, I noticed growing up and just being in a college environment with men and women and dating and all of that. So after going to that, I bought his book, got really excited about it, took his class, also took a class with Cindy Meston, my other current advisor, which was human sexuality. And basically the combination of the two was really, really interesting to me. And I hadn't learned much about either. And I decided that that's what I wanted to do. I told my family and they were like, what's an evolutionary psychologist? And that's that's how I got into this. Laith Al-Shwaf, which has been on your podcast as well, was actually my PA. So full circle here. But yeah, so just going to UT for undergrad, learned about it. And then worked with Christine Laguerre as a research assistant, also in Cindy's lab. And then here I am. I got in fall 2017, and I still love it as much as I did then.
I guess what about it was interesting? I mean, was it just not as much exposure as to that content, or it just was things clicked and made more sense? Or I guess what kind of pulled you to it from the talk and then further out?
Yeah, I mean, I think even now I find it really interesting because you can think about things from an evolutionary perspective, right? So what adaptive pressures did we face and how has that influenced our psychology? And I had really never thought about it that way. And I think it makes sense of a lot of things like sex differences, which is a big area of interest to me. And I remember being at the talk that David gave, and he was describing The study that I think was done in Florida, if I recall correctly, where they're going around campus, they're asking men, would you call somebody that you just met? Would you have sex with somebody that you haven't met? And there's just these stark sex differences in a lot of different aspects of our sexual psychology. And I thought it was incredibly interesting. And, again, being at UT, which is a huge university, and trying to date people and just seeing, oh, men are so weird, what's going on here? And it did. Yeah, it just kind of clicked, made sense of a lot of things that I had not thought about, at least from an evolutionary perspective.
Is it, this is, I guess, a semi-personal question, but sometimes I think when this happens to me too, when you're so kind of ensconced in kind of the research and so much of the, I guess, clinical or scientific elements, it just kind of, it kind of dulls you to things that most people would be like, that's, strange to think about, or whatever. I mean, I was reading a book on evolution of beauty and aesthetics, and by Richard Prum, and it's a great book. And there's a chapter in there about how ducks copulate and all this stuff. And I was sharing it with somebody, and as I was explaining it, it was very like kind of scientific and impersonal. And when I finished, they were just looking at me like I had 20 heads. They're like, so let me get this straight. You're talking about ducks having sex. And I was like, yeah, but you have to understand like how, like some of the adaptive elements and why that happens, and then how that translates, and the, kind of the piece of sexual selection, and then sexual ornamentation, and, what are the stimulus, like all these things. And it just was like, they just couldn't really get it. They're just like, yeah, I get it, but like, that's weird, man. It's just like, it's not weird. It's not weird for me. It's interesting, and so I don't know. Do you ever feel like it becomes like almost too impersonal, like looking at research and all this stuff, and it's just like, oh yeah, like, I have to kind of like make sure I adjust when I'm at dinner parties and things like that.
Totally, right? Like, I think especially when dating, so, I'm relatively young, still figuring that out, but going on dates even is very confusing because I just know way too much about male psychology. But yeah, totally. I mean, even going to places like zoos, like, there are peacocks, and I go on these like huge rants about like, oh, well, Darwin was really upset about the idea of peacocks. He couldn't figure it out. Why are they so bright? But it's only the males. And I kind of live for those moments. Those are the moments that when I get to share this with people who aren't in the field, that don't know these things, I can see this kind of light bulb go on when they're not, when they're not like rolling their eyes, like, hey, I'm just trying to have some wine tonight,
Right.
But no, I love those moments. I love, especially with my family and friends, like, I go out with my mom, for example, we're at dinner and her friends are asking me about my research, and my mom doesn't really understand quite what I do. She's telling people, oh, she's going to be a doctor. Sure, a philosophy, and I'm just explaining like sex differences, men's desire for sexual variety, for example, interest in short-term mating, and her friends find it amazing. And then they start going on these like stories of, oh yeah, when I noticed these things and this, and I'm like, well, that actually makes sense if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective. But I love those moments, I do. But people do look at you a little weird, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe it's a little bit easier for you because I think specifically talking about humans. So there's kind of like an easy it's like an easy on ramp to be like, oh yeah, we can see how this kind of applies, or things like that. I think when people study birds or other animals, it's just like, oh, that's weird.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. So the primary, I know you had said that your primary interest was, obviously on the evolutionary piece, sex differences, and then sexual disgust, which we'll get to. But I want to kind of, start by first talking about disgust itself as an emotion. And, I think disgust is an interesting emotion from what we know and what we continue to research and find out about it, more so of understanding it as almost an emotional system, as opposed to this kind of unitary, you have it or you don't. There's many components to it. I mean, there's other components to other emotions too, but disgust really does, at least in my mind, seem to function as a system. And so I guess first off, before we talk about what it is and how we define it and distinguish it, where does it fit within the world of emotions in terms of, we have the basic emotions, which is where it fits in, but does it have any crossover or kind of overlap with some of the self-conscious emotions, pride, shame, etc.? Or, how do we make those kind of distinctions of where disgust fits in the basic ones as opposed to not the other current taxonomy we have, and why that might be?
Yeah, great question. So I also think of disgust as a system. I think that you said this, but it is recognized as one of the basic human emotions. There are universally recognized facial expressions, for example, so the curling of the upper lip. But I think it's really interesting because it also is associated with a variety of physiological responses sometimes, right? So nausea, vomiting, nervous system activation. And I think within the world of other emotions like pride and shame, I think of emotions as these kind of superordinate mechanisms where if they overlap, they overlap. What inputs are going into the system that's triggering an emotion. And although it was initially conceptualized as dealing with ingestion, rather, within the past few decades, scientists have proposed that it does have these different functions. So it's maybe not just to avoid pathogens, or maybe it's serving other problems that we face during our evolutionary history as well. And I typically, I do think of disgust, unsurprisingly, mostly from an evolutionary perspective, but I think some really good work in this area is Tiber and colleagues' 2009 paper, which is kind of how I got into this. Really, it was my Bible, my first year of graduate school. I read it so many times, but that's a really good one. And then another useful paper, I think, for understanding emotions and disgust in particular is Alschwath and colleagues' 2015 paper on human emotions, which is based on some earlier work by Tooby and Kosmides, which really outlines how emotions are these superordinate mechanisms. They guide our behavior in specific ways. And there's very complex, but I think, fits in the system of all emotions.
Yeah, so I think that's good. I think that's really, really good because you're outlining that, yes, it's a basic emotion, but that it does have crossover in many certain ways because, as you would imagine, there's a system, right? So you're getting inputs from the environment, how our bodies, at the very least from an evolutionary perspective, are going to have a response to the inputs we have. And at bottom, kind of your core or basic or whatever you want to call it, disgust mode is, pathogen avoidance. Of course, we know many other things about it, but so I guess to just nail this down a little bit more as much as you can, how do we know? So there's the facial expressions, which I think is, I know some people kind of critique, Ekman, but he was really important for understanding facial expressions for disgust. But how do we know that disgust is a basic emotion in terms of, I think there's 5 or 6 of the basic emotions. So disgust, joy, sadness, anger. Jessica Tracy thinks pride is a basic emotion. I think she's probably right, but whatever. So, it's 6 or 7 maybe. But what makes it, I guess, basic as from all the other ones? It's at birth. It's in our originates in kind of the brain stem and goes all the way out to prefrontal cortex and the cortical layers. How do we understand that it sits within joy, sadness, anger, all that stuff? As because this will be important for understanding the kind of evolutionary nature of it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the really important thing here with thinking about disgust, but other emotions as well, is it universal? For example, do I only see it in specific cultures? And disgust, it is universal. There's evidence of that. But then also, if you think about other species, right? So we
Mm-hmm.
see disgust in other species as well. Although that, is definitely less clear, I think. There are some examples of the late Val Curtis, where she talks about disgust and maybe grooming behaviors, but also in different insects. There's some evidence that chimpanzees exhibit disgust whenever you expose them to feces or food that has been associated with feces, for example.
Right.
But I think that's really how I like to think about it, is if there is evidence for universality, I do think that it is present quite young, and you can see that. I mean, have you seen those videos of the kids like eating lemons, for example? Like they don't know what to do with themselves.
Right.
Yeah, and exactly.
Yeah, I think that that's important for people to understand, because I think that there's the whole, blank slate argument and things like that, right? And that's usually more in a cognitive piece, but that these things in terms of emotions are important. And so while most people currently think about disgust typically in a negative way, it serves an adaptive function and purpose.
Absolutely.
So we've kind of been flirting around it. So how do you typically define disgust? And how do we understand that as different from maybe distaste? That there's some differences there, at least at a kind of a ground level.
Yeah, great question. So I think the evolutionary functionality of disgust is to avoid exposure to pathogens. So it's really this avoidance piece that I think is critical to think about, which would be different from distaste. Maybe I don't like this, but it's not necessarily going to get me sick, so I'm just not going to eat it. Versus, am I being exposed to rotten meat, for example? It'd be really costly to just eat that, assume it would be fine. But I think that a really helpful way, at least that I try to think about it, is as conceptualized by the behavioral immune system, which has really been talked about largely by Mark Schaller. And the basic argument here is infections are metabolically costly for our body. It takes a lot of energy to fight them off. And so disgust, or the behavioral immune system, is kind of this first line response to avoid pathogen-laden situations, or people, for example, to circumvent these really costly immune responses. And I think, you can think about error management theory as well, which I kind of touched on earlier, but certain errors are less costly. So it might be less costly to eat a piece of chocolate that's been left out. That's actually a bad example. I'm not sure why I'm going there. But anyway, thinking about the cost benefit analysis, is it better to have disgust in situations where maybe it's not that costly, but you're not avoiding anything by not eating that thing, versus eating something incorrectly, assuming that it doesn't have pathogens, getting really sick, having these costly immune responses, for example.
I think that that's great. I wonder if there are some things that are obviously fairly obvious for us in terms of disgust and this core feature that you're describing. So, for example, this kind of breaks down, I guess, on some of the levels to it. So there's one level, right, of ingestion, right? Am I going to put something in my body, right? So if I everyone, I would assume most people have had this experience where I had this one time. It was terrible. I went to go and get milk, and I don't drink milk. I don't really drink. I drink my coffee black. I don't really use milk like that. But I was, I think, gonna get cereal, right? And I go to get cereal, and I go in the fridge, and I go for the milk, and I didn't really think about it, and I just poured in the cereal, and I take that first bite, and the milk was sour.
Oh, great.
Oh, it's the worst. It is the worst. And I immediately spit it out. I went and put, brushed my teeth 4 times and, mouthwash. It's the worst thing. There are some things where we don't want to put in our body, right? Or ingest certain things. But sometimes there could be pathogens that are, that we're not ingesting, but they're in our vicinity. So, for example, if I'm walking out in the street and I'm on the sidewalk and I see a pile of feces or puddle of urine, I'm going to feel disgust, right? But I'm going to walk around it and keep going.
Right.
How do we understand the levels of this core kind of element of disgust? Of yes, there's things that I could probably break this down further. Of sometimes we will know, oh, okay, that's sour milk. Don't put that in my body. Sometimes oh, that's bleach. Don't drink that. But sometimes we don't know if something could be harmful, and we figure it out by accident, or when we're ingesting it. So I guess the two things I'm asking are the difference between ingestion or putting something in our body, and being in the environment or atmosphere in which we find something disgusting at this core level.
Yeah, that's a really good question, or two questions rather. I mean, so for the ingestion piece, I think you pointed out something really interesting, right? Is that take a bite of it, sour milk, you spit it out. Why did you spit it out? If disgust wasn't activated, would you just swallow it and decide, I'm just not going to drink the rest of that. That didn't taste so good. I think it's really this piece that you're expelling this from your body. You're spitting it out, brushing your teeth. Why is that? Avoidance of pathogens. But then if you think about the other example you gave, being in the vicinity, I don't think that you're going to necessarily maybe get bugs in your feet if you step in, dog poop or whatever. But you're still avoiding it. Like you're not gonna be propelled to go walk through it. You're gonna go around it, move on with your day. And I think that basically it comes down to thinking about disgust as this kind of computational system where there are inputs and there are behavioral outputs. Inside, there's this black box, our brain, that's calculating some kind of cost-benefit ratio, and it's either approach or avoidance, right? But there's also this gray area. And so I think that you're maybe speaking to the gray areas of, yeah, I'm in the vicinity of these things, but they're not directly going into my body, but they still might be important to avoid. And so I think just thinking about it in terms of, is this system being triggered? What's the behavioral output? Well, the behavioral output is still avoiding these things, just not necessarily as obviously as ingesting it or, spitting it out. And I think sexual disgust is something that is really interesting with this, because a lot of sexual disgust, which we'll get into, has to deal with avoiding, maybe potential partners that you're not necessarily kissing them. Sure, you do swap pathogens, but other than that, like hugging somebody maybe you're not ingesting anything here, but it's still maybe costly to expose yourself to specific partners or situations that may have different costs associated with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the sexual disgust piece, because I know that's your primary focus area, and there's many things to ask about that. Just kind of on one of the things you said, it made me think about it in a kind of an abstract way. So how much I'm forgetting I know for moral disgust it's anterior insula, but I don't remember the brain region for kind of the core disgust, if it's the same thing. But for example, how much does the impact of long-term memory have on disgust? Because, for example, if I'm watching a film, right, and it's a film, it's not real, it's not happening, but if I see somebody on the film, eating throw up, that sounds terrible. Oh God, I can't even.
Horrible film.
Oh God, right? I don't watch these kinds of films. For all the listeners out there, I do not watch these kinds of films.
Sure.
I'm just trying to find the most grotesque example. Even thinking about that, right? So this is kind of like very much an abstraction thing, but it's kind of revolting. Right. But I wouldn't watch that. I would avert my eyes. I don't want to watch this. This is gross. This is disgust. It's a lot of disgust. But we're not ingesting it. Right. We're not around it. It's not real. Where do we put that? My assumption would be that our disgust brain at that moment, or system rather, it kind of overtakes the brain and just says it can't really necessarily make those discriminations. Like, yeah, anything like that, well, we remember that this is not something good and we don't even want to watch that or think about that. So I guess my question is on the abstraction piece is how much does memory, I guess, play into this for helping us survive, to be like, yeah, don't do that, or don't eat that, or don't be around that, or don't even watch or think about that, because it's, you know, maybe the filtering isn't the best, but you know, how do you kind of think about it in that way?
Yeah, I mean, so I think at least with this example of, you know, watching a movie, maybe they're eating vomit, our favorite, you're still getting an input there, right? Like it's still a visual input. And so your brain is still perhaps going to be activated, like, oh, avoidance. But I think it comes back to what I said earlier of kind of a cost benefit analysis. Like, you being revolted by the sight of something on a video, you're not experiencing any cost necessarily. Like, you're just like, oh no, that's bad, my brain's triggered, like you said, it's an automatic response. Versus maybe you don't have that response, and then in a real situation, if you don't have the response either, then that's costly. So I really think it's about these inputs. You're seeing this visual thing. Sure, you're not close to it, you're not smelling it, you're not touching it, thankfully, right? But you're still getting these triggers or these inputs into this this system, which is activating this behavioral output or response.
The last thing I'll ask about this here is so this kind of starts to branch out to other forms of more like social psych stuff, but if we see, I'm just gonna, again, this kind of gets more in the interpersonal, subjective experiences and things like that. But if I'm on the street and I see somebody on the street and they are, you know, their hands are in their pants and they're doing something. You know, it's just someone in front of them, behind them. They're doing something, right? And, you know, I don't want to think about it, but, you know, I can obviously see, and they're just doing some gross stuff. There's a certain, I would imagine, disgust emotion that's going to come online there for me. But then, and this is my point, there's going to be, in a sense, a type of association and or potential discrimination and or potential judgment. I'm not necessarily saying a moral judgment, we may get to that later, but just on the disgust piece of, oh, I shouldn't be around this person, right? So now it's not only just the action, or not. Sometimes this person is doing this, you know. So this is I don't know if you know this story, but the coach for the German soccer team, national German soccer team. I think this was back in 2010 or 2014. So silly, but people would find him. This is so gross to say, but they would find him like picking his nose, and they could catch him on camera, or he would be trying to like tuck in his shirt in his pants, and then he would do that and then like smell his hands, and it's just like, bro, like, what are you doing, man? Like just on the sideline during a game. It's just so gross. And again, it's like people, at least people that I would talk to, you know, big soccer fans, where I would be like, yeah, he's a good coach, but I would not want to get near that guy. Like, what are you doing? And you know, and all, I don't know anything. If he has some kind of tick or he has some kind of condition or whatever, I don't know that. And so I wouldn't want to try to say anything negative, but, you know, people were just kind of like catching this. And I think he joked about it in a press conference or something afterwards. But my point is that we would make an association, or we would make a judgment based on some of the behavior that we find, you know, that has some element of disgust. So I guess it's a little bit branching out in terms of social norms and attributions and, you know, kind of judgment. But how do you see, I guess my question here is, disgust as not only a preventative thing, but also as information to then make certain analysis or certain decisions or things like that?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. And it also reminds me of some research that has been done as well with at least whenever the behavioral immune system kind of was first being discussed, about, disgust and xenophobia, for example, which Tiber and colleagues have done some recent work on that, which I highly recommend that paper, which I can send to you because I'm blanking on the name and the year. But yeah, I mean, I do think that it also can be associated with people and judgments. And I think that that's really an interesting thing. And why is that? Is it because, again, being associated with this person has some sort of cost? Is it the pathogen threat? Is it social reputational damage cost, for example? Right. And I think that's unclear, at least my knowledge of it. But I think it does come into play. I mean, even if you think about, I just keep going back to sexual disgust, obviously. I'm more familiar with this, but at least like sexual disgust. So there's this huge sex difference in it. But one of the potential reasons may be because there are differences in the reputational damage that men and women face by being labeled as a disgusting person, for example, or not having the correct responses to promiscuity or things like that. So I think that's a roundabout way of just saying that. Again, I think maybe it's linked with judgments or cost. And overall, are you going to be labeled as somebody to avoid if you associate with those people? Maybe. And that's costly.
Yeah. An example there with the sexual disgust piece could be something like, in terms of association or whatever, if somebody is dating somebody and they go to a dinner party and they say, oh, here's my partner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they've been dating for, I don't know, 6 months. And somewhere in the conversation, it comes out that person is HIV positive. There would be maybe overtly or not. I would think for some people, a shift on, people would have questions at the very least of, how did they have this conversation? Is that person potentially exposed? And of course we have, good remedy, and proactive measures for that and things like that. But, people don't know someone's backstory, but kind of what you're saying about the association piece, certain judgments, et cetera, in terms of social norms, those are things that are potentially there in terms of not wanting to become sick or not wanting to become, ill if it's able to be spread.
Right. And I think, at least with that example, I think one thing that's confusing for me, actually, that have been thinking about recently is morality versus disgust. Like, if you're making a judgment, is it a moral judgment? Is that different than experiencing disgust? Does disgust trigger this judgment? Is judgment disgust? Like, it's very unclear to me. But I think you make an interesting point. And I think at least with that particular example, if people aren't having sex with that person themselves, then it's not necessarily going to impact them, right?
Right. Who cares, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, why is there stigma? Why would this judgment be activated? And it may be exactly kind of getting back to what we're saying of, is it costly to associate with that person? Maybe, maybe not. But I think that our brains kind of sometimes get hijacked by just these inputs that, again, we have this calculation go on and it's avoidance approach and disgust can be activated. Yeah. Thinking about positive versus negative, right? And I think it's really interesting when you think about disgust and emotions in general, because I don't actually find that very helpful to think about things as positive versus negative. So I think a more helpful way to think about these things is, are they serving the adaptive function? So this, again, finding somebody who has an STI or seeing vomit on TV, just getting back to that. Are these emotions doing what they're designed to do? Is it more costly for them not to be activated? So say with these judgments, if I'm not judging somebody who's picking their nose, is that costly? Is that why I just have this automatic reaction that's gross? And I think that is something that is important to think about as well.
Yeah, the reason for that question about is a few reasons why I asked that question about the idea of positive and negative emotions. It's widely used within self-help books and pop psych and various websites, and even in the literature. People will use that taxonomy of positive, negative emotions, etc. And I think in research, it's probably not a great thing to do, but within the research world, people kind of know what they're trying to say. They're trying to just classify and group things. It's maybe a little lazy, or it's not as sharp as it should be, but most people get what it is. I think for people that aren't doing social psych or evolutionary psych or clinical psych, and just the kind of the layman that's out in the world, and they pick up a book and someone says these are positive emotions, these are negative emotions, they usually think of these are good emotions and these are bad emotions. So I don't want bad emotions, and I just want all good ones. Right. So I asked this question to Jessica Tracy when she was on. I asked this question to June Tagney when she was on. She's the big researcher on shame, and I'm asking you now, and you guys have all said the same answer. And so, and it's interesting because that's the exact same answer that I have. That was the answer my dissertation chairwoman told me as well. She's like, we got to get out of the business of saying positive, negative stuff. I mean, we get what we mean, but it's not accurate. It's not sharp. And because it's trying to give this kind of false dichotomy of not even a false dichotomy. It's trying to put, in essence, a type of, let me say valence, but you're trying to give some kind of topspin of, oh, well, these are good and these are bad. And trying to correct for that is really important because of what you just said, which is how do we understand their adaptive functioning? So, I mean, I remember one time I got into a really heated debate with a friend of mine because he was just telling me how jealousy is bullshit and like I don't even know why we fucking have this, and like he was like so animated. He was like, this is a terrible emotion, it's awful, it's just there's nothing good about it. I mean, he was just really adamant about it. And I said, yeah, I hear you, there's a lot of that for sure, but there are adaptive functions for it.
Eye roll of your friend.
Right. And he was just like, dude, come on, man. I was just like, no, you have to understand essentially how emotions work from, at the very least, an evolutionary model, where we sit in the that lineage within the world and with various mammals and animals in general in the tree. And then, how do we understand emotions for us specifically and how they present? Because they are going to present differently than in other species. But then understanding that our emotions, and some emotions that I think some emotions are specific to humans and how we've evolved, or at least the higher presentation. There's a function for it. There's a function for that. And that's not a just so story like, oh, there's this thing that we have, and so we got to find the thing to make sense of it.
Labeling it, right.
There's adaptive functions to it. Even something as horrible as shame, something as horrible as jealousy. And so I think disgust fits in here as well. And so I think if people, the main reason I asked that question is because if people are walking around thinking, oh, disgust is a bad emotion, right? It's a negative emotion. We're going to, really get, I think, blindsided by some of the ways in which it can help us, or kind of this hindrance or avoidance or preventative measures, etc. Obviously you can overemphasize the avoidance or hindrance sometimes. This is a balance of sorts, but obviously bound to come up at some point, but Inside Out did a really nice job of this, right? It's a great film, and it does, Disgust is the is that Bill Hader, right? He was the one that did the voice of Disgust, I think. I can't remember who it was.
I can't remember, but I love that film. Yeah,
it's great. And the reason, Disgust is not featured so much. No, he was.
I think Disgust was
a woman.
I remember.
I'm forgetting who it was. Anyways, but it did a nice job of showing like the importance and value of sadness and an emotion that people really don't like feeling, fair, and rightfully so. That's fair. And I think disgust can be that way sometimes for people too. They don't want to feel that, or it's not great. So, Yeah. So you don't like the positive negative kind of labeling.
Right.
We've talked about kind of the adaptive features of disgust, but what else would you say about, okay, if it's not positive, negative, what's a way of kind of, you think, classifying or understanding these kind of emotions, disgust included?
Yeah. I mean, so I think actually of all emotions is positive insofar as that they are serving this adaptive function,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you can even think about like anxiety, for example. I mean, this is huge in clinical psychology. It's like learning about mindfulness, I think, is really this piece where you can notice anxiety. Sure, maybe it doesn't feel pleasant, but a lot of times anxiety can actually be really helpful and sadness can be helpful and it can motivate behaviors in specific directions, for example, like what you're saying with sadness from inside out. Um, and so I really just try to think about, okay, so are the emotions responding appropriately in specific contexts? If we see vomit, maybe we have this reaction, great. Or even further, are they being activated at inopportune times? Again, I think it comes back to this kind of cost benefit thing. Sometimes experiencing disgust when maybe there's really not a pathogen threat, you're not going to lose much there, right? However, there are also, it can go the other way, where if you have too much disgust then or too much anxiety, right, then you can actually have these behavioral responses that can be not very helpful, such as avoiding situations or people inappropriately and only leaving your house never, right, if you're too anxious or something like that. And that's not great either. And at least in clinical psychology, at some point, probably more about this than I do, so take this with a grain of salt, not a clinician. But there used to be like sexual aversion, right? I think it actually got removed from the DSM. But you can't have these emotions be activated too often for some people, and that's not good either. And so I just try to think about, what's the adaptive function? Is the emotion doing that correctly? Is it not? Is it being activated too much? That good or bad, whatever, I don't think that's particularly helpful.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with everything you're saying. Just to kind of maybe, put a finer point on this is that I would mostly probably agree with what you're saying about all emotions are positive or potentially positive, I guess.
Totally.
They're trying to tell us something, right? I always say it's the smoke detector in the house. It's the neon sign. It's it's those things that are telling you other things. It doesn't necessarily, it's not prescriptive necessarily, right? And emotions aren't behaviors, right? And there's a difference between feelings and emotions and affect, right? Those are all different things. And that's a hard kind of nuance, but emotions usually have to interact with behaviors. They interact with thinking. They interact. It's a more wider kind of palette there. But I think if people reconceptualize how emotions are, you're not seeing some as the kind of, these negative things, and you're having more of a, I think, right attitude in how to manage them, as opposed to, well, those are my feelings and that's it. It's like, well, yeah, but they're not prescriptive. They're not telling you how to do a behavior. They're not telling you what action to take. They're just telling you to pay attention or to notice this, or, what could you do? Or, and at the very least, I mean, there's many other social emotions can be much, much, much more complicated, but at the very least it is doing that. And so I think we have to have, for many people in terms of science communicators or educators or scientists, we need to be able to clearly and accurately discuss what emotions are, what they are not. And I find that many folks that are writing popular materials are highly misinformed, and it just makes my work much more harder and many other people's work much more harder, because we have to correct all this bullshit.
Right. But it's sexy, so the layperson's gonna read it and pick up on it, and totally, I agree.
Yeah. So real quick, because before we get into sexual disgust, let's just talk about the kind of system, because we had mentioned that, so this will kind of set up for it. So most people, I think, don't know this, or some people might, but a lot of people talk about John Haidt. He's great. He Righteous Mind is a great book. Obviously, The Coddling was, kind of prescient before its time. But before John Haidt did those books, I think Happiness Hypothesis, that was the first book. He's a bona fide scholar. He was the guy on Disgust and all the stuff he published, and especially on moral disgust. And him and
Rosin.
Yes, Rosin. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And I remember in textbooks and in the literature, reading his stuff when he was putting it out. I'm showing my age here a little bit, but it's he's like a big deal, and that's his main thing. And obviously he's gone on to do other things, as one does, but in terms of being a researcher and things like that, and just for listeners' clarity, he's one of the biggest social psychologists and probably in the world, and he has a lot of big influence and stuff. But before, when he was doing research, it was on disgust, and specifically moral disgust. I think Paul Bloom also did a lot of. He did a lot of stuff with cognitive learning and things like that with infants. But he also has done research on morals and disgust as well. Yeah. But the big thing is Haidt's multidimensional model, right? Which is this kind of tripart model, which is there's gender disgust, which we've been talking about, sexual disgust, which is your area, and then moral disgust. And so I have a little bit of some older literature bouncing around in my head. But what is the current, party line on this kind of seeing disgust as a system, and have we replicated this and understand it this way? Have we made adjustments to it, or just kind of where are we in 4 months from 2022 for understanding disgust as a system and this kind of tripart model?
Yeah, I think most people are in agreement that it is a system and it regulates behaviors in specific ways. When I think of Haidt's work on disgust, I think of his work with Rosin and colleagues, where they're really arguing for these multiple domains, as you mentioned, including things like food and animals and, body products, sex, body envelope violations, etc. And I also think about the disgust scale. So they developed a scale that, measures core disgust, animal disgust, some magical thinking. But as the Bible paper that I pointed out, Tiber et al., 2009, my fave, there are some theoretical and methodological issues or concerns with this conceptualization of disgust. So animal reminder disgust, for example, is really big in this model. And they argue that functions to remind us of our animal nature or our mortality overall. And that argument follows terror management theory. So that is, we should be aware of and fear our own death. And many evolutionary scientists have pointed out that doesn't have any clear adaptive value. And so I think that's important to keep in mind when thinking of this kind of model of disgust. But then also the domains of disgust scale, the scale that I was talking about earlier, has low internal reliability. As a result, they argue to use a composite of the items, not these separate kind of domains. But in practice, many people don't actually do that. So they, will look at these separate domains and see how it relates to other things, but it doesn't have that great of reliability. And you also asked about replication. So that scale has been revised multiple times. And their recent revision actually ignores sex completely. And I think that, because of sexual selection, and it is, at least for sexually reproducing species, sex and reproducing is the driving force of natural selection, right? And so I think that's definitely a concern or a limitation of that. But I do think that Haidt's work with disgust and this conceptualization was really important for highlighting the multidimensionality of disgust and disgust as a system, which we have been talking about. But I think, at least in evolutionary psychology, the theoretically and methodologically, most supported model is the Tiber et al. Kind of model where we have moral disgust, sexual disgust, pathogen disgust, those big three domains. And then within that, as you know, other people, including myself, have started looking into each of those separately, could also have their own, you know, multi-dimensional kind of domains, if you will, multi-dimensional domains. That's yeah.
I think I think that that's really helpful, because I think sometimes people will. This happens a lot actually in the social sciences. People get really excited about an idea and they just hold on to it for dear life, and it has to be the fifth gospel, the 11th commandment. And if it's not, then it's like, you know, people will get very angry about this. And I think the thing with Haidt's work is that, you know, with most research is when something hasn't been done, you're poking around, you're trying to figure it out, and you can be a very good researcher, very good investigator, but people are going to come. I mean, you've written papers, you know how this goes, right? You know, you write in future directions, or, you know, weaknesses of the study. You know, here's the ways in which people could go and, you know, keep further exploring this. And I think many people, it sounds like what you're saying, many people have done that and said, this was really, really good. It still holds as a system, but we've been doing more research over the past 15 years, and we've been, you know, continuing to build off of it, and, you know, making it even better and stronger and firmer. And it sounds like, you know, much of the work of what many people have been doing.
Yeah, and I actually think this is a really important just part of science, right? Like,
yes.
Especially with, you know, the open science movement and replicability issues, not to get on my little soapbox, but I think it's really important, right? Like, I'm not saying, and no one has said, oh, Haidt's work is wrong. It's no, that was really helpful. Disgust is a system. How can we build on it? You know, right. I mean, I think my own work, I don't think is the golden standard of anything. It's like, I mean, maybe I'm a graduate student, as you say, but it's really just trying to advance our understanding of all of these different things, which are inherently really complex. We don't know. Maybe the first way isn't the right way. Just keep doing it, replicate, etc. And I think that, yeah, I mean, his work has been pivotal for a lot of work on disgust and morality and all of these things, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's I think it is a really important, you know, quick commercial for why we need to, we definitely need to do that in the social sciences, especially with, I'm with you on the replication crisis and many issues there. So I guess the one thing here leading into the next point is you've mentioned a bunch now about the evolutionary framework that we have. And so what is anything you want to say? I mean, we've talked about it a lot at this point, but is there anything else you want to say just in terms of a structural point of the evolutionary framework of disgust? How does disgust present and display and express with us as humans, and how does it do it differently in other animals? You have mentioned how it presents in chimps. And so, yeah, what are the similarities, differences of disgust expression, between primates and then other social mammals, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that I've probably said, but that I want to harp on here is disgust, but also just emotions in general. I think it's really important, and you've said this as well, just to remember that evolutionarily, they coordinate behaviors, right? And so, but they must do so appropriately. Coordinate behaviors is not something done easily. And so I think emotions are really critical. But I think that requires this really complex kind of or this system of tasks, if you will, where you have to coordinate the correct behavioral outputs in the appropriate order to solve these tasks, for example. But I think the most critical part is that emotions are superordinate mechanisms coordinating our behavior to solve adaptive problems. Yeah. And I think that disgust, and this is not my piece, this is definitely borrowed from earlier work as well, is that so insofar as, disgust is helping us avoid pathogens, situations, partners, or risky, any of these that pose risk, I think that it's being an evolutionary emotion, if you will. And I think it's a computational system coordinates behaviors.
No, that's great. No, I think that's super important, because the biggest thing that I hope listeners, walk away with is, at the very least, is that they understand disgust, what it is and what it isn't, what is its adaptive functioning, and how they can understand really some of the utility of it. And you can kind of see how that can manifest in, our everyday types of behaviors. So I think that's super important. So now that we've done or discussed the basic core element of disgust, one of the major parts of the kind of system is sexual disgust. So this is the area specifically that you've spent how many years researching now? 3, 4?
Going on year 5.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that you know a few things about it. Yeah, a little bit. Okay. So before we talk about this sexual disgust, we'll break this up a little bit, and we have to we got to talk about sex first. I mean, I think you have to kind of define your terms and kind of set the groundwork. So, how do you define, I guess, kind of with the idea of some of the research you'll discuss, how do you define sexual relations, copulation, intercourse, etc.? And kind of with that, humans have multiple reasons for engaging in sexual activity. Obviously, procreation is a big one, but there are many elements of aesthetics and beauty based on sexual ornamentation. And some argue that not everything has an adaptation piece to it, that there is just some beauty happens. You can chat about that if you want as well, some of the debates about that. But I guess first off, how do we define sexual relations, intercourse? What are the boundaries of that? And, how do we understand what that is operationally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So speaking of reasons people have sex, I mean, my advisors have spent a portion of their career talking about these, investigating these. There are a lot, I think 237 reasons to be exact. But
that's it? Only 237?
No, I'm sure there are more, at least in
it's a lot.
Their initial study, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, but totally. I think of sex as anything, partners, for example, situations that are tapping into some goal here. I think, of course, sexually reproducing is the most critical adaptive problem that we as humans face. So I think of it kind of in that way, but there are a lot of behaviors. There are obviously intercourse, there is cunnilingus, there's a whole variety. You can do whatever you want. I mean, it really goes on. I think you can look into things like sexual fantasies even, or fetishes. I mean, we could talk about all of this for the rest of the world's existence. But yeah, I mean, I primarily think about it in terms of finding a mate, choosing a partner, having sex, reproducing, and anything that can be involved in that. I mean, there's pleasure, of course, all of these things, but
I guess with that, just my loose question here is, I don't like having, I've said this many times, I hate having arguments and discussions about like terms and defining them, because like everyone can just find a different way to define things. But there are many people that will say that oral sex or anal sex or whatever is not, that there's a different kind of dimension to it, because you can't procreate that way. You can procreate one way. Other people will say it's otherwise. Are those just ancillary or kind of a tertiary way to like sexual intercourse? So do we see that as like kind of the main feature, or do we really include all aspects of, for example, someone that is engaging in oral sex, is that we can say, yeah, that's sexual relations. That's, it's obviously different from intercourse, but it's a type of sexual relations, or, again, we don't have to get too in the weeds of it, but just in terms of how we're operationalizing things, does that kind of track or?
Yeah, I mean, I think sexual intercourse is the thing that I primarily think of, at least with regards to sexual disgust. So sexual intercourse and reproducing, finding a mate. But I also think I'm not somebody who would say that oral sex or anal sex isn't sex. I think it's totally sex. I mean, this is sexual in nature. You're not just maybe going to do this like when I don't even know what I'm trying to give some bad example, but I think of those things as sex. I think anything that's being done with sex in mind or pleasure, or where you're with your partner, sex. I mean, I wouldn't say that insofar as, is cuddling sex? No. Is holding hand sex? No. Oral sex, anal sex, all of that. I mean, I think of that as sex, but I'm also in a sex lab. So.
Right. So there are, I guess my main question here is there are boundaries of what we consider sexual and something that is not sexual. Right. So cuddling, holding hands.
Right.
Those are not sexual, although yes, they maybe they could be applied in different buckets here, right? You could, you could hold someone's hand and it not be sexual, but you could hold someone's hand and it could be sexual. So there's some variance there.
I also think that, I mean, at least like what people conceptualize, I think it's very context dependent. I think it differs by individual, for example. And so I think it's hard to even say, like you say with the hand holding example, that could be sexual, it could not be sexual. But I think it's really up to the individual of interest to label whatever experience as sex or not sex. But at least with regards to my research, I primarily studied the main things that you think of with sex: intercourse, oral sex, anal sex, and the rest of the popular ones.
Yeah. Okay. So how do we understand sexual selection? Right. So obviously, I mean, I've talked about evolution a handful of times here. So I think most people understand the kind of basics of natural selection. Sexual selection was Darwin's very dangerous idea, something that people didn't really pick up till 100 years later in Descent of Man, right? So explain to us, just give us the primer on sexual selection, and how that kind of fits into the story here.
Yeah, totally. So I think the really beautiful example that sticks in my head all the time, at least when I first learned about this, is Darwin's confusion about peacocks, which I alluded to earlier, but I didn't go into it. But basically, I think he said something like, the sight of peacocks gives me nightmares. And he really couldn't figure out, why do male peacocks have this neon sign to predators if we're trying to just survive and not be eaten to death or killed or whatever. And I think this is really what kind of started his thinking on sexual selection. So basically the idea here is features that pose costs for maybe predation, for example, such as this neon sign that says, hey, come eat me, can be selected for because they increase the chance of sexually reproducing. So it actually turns out that female peahens, I think, they really are attracted to this brilliant plumage. And so why is that, right? So what is sexual selection? So basically, he recognized at least two different kind of mechanisms of sexual selection, if you will. So there's intersexual selection, which is competition between members of the same sex. David, at least I remember learning about this as two stags interlocking their antlers, fighting over mates, or intersexual selection, which is where members of one sex choose members of the opposite sex. And I think that kind of speaks to the peacock example, if you will. And so I think what's really important to remember is that sexual selection is, can operate and select for things that are costly in terms of natural selection or just survival, because they aid in successfully reproducing, at least for sexually reproducing species.
Okay. And so when we get to, sexual selection is important, right? Because there is an adaptive function to it. And again, I think it's um, what's the handicap principle, right? You kind of alluded to it. It was just like, well, why would this? Talking about the plumage of the peacock, it has this. Not only is the peacock's tail extremely brightly colored and it's very beautiful and all of these things, but it also like significantly weighs down the bird. Yeah. Like it's like, it's like literally dragging. So, but this peacock, right? So not only is it the bright colors and all of the intricacies of each individual parts of the feather, but it's also the weight, and it carries it down. It can't really run away from predators, things like that, and all these things. And so, kind of what you're saying is that there's with these things in mind, there is this element of, well, when the female is trying to choose a mate, there is something there of which, this idea of mate choice comes into play in terms of sexual selection.
Totally, yeah. And there, at least these handicaps, peacock plumage, they're often indicators of like heritability, viability, good genes, if you will. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind as well. So why do we have these mate choices? Well, maybe these things are associated with living longer, or having these good genes, if you will.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing, I think, in terms of natural or sexual selection is how do we, obviously we're not aware of this, but are all living organisms are trying to find ways in which their genes get to the next generation so they can keep surviving. This is kind of Dawkins' selfish gene is kind of a very butchered version of that. So let's talk about, I guess, in terms of defining terms, how do we define and distinguish between sexual desire and sexual arousal, and why are those different, or why are those differences important, I should say?
Yeah, so this is a critical distinction, one that I have learned primarily through my advisor, Sydney Meston. So some researchers argue that desire is not distinct from sexual arousal, but I think that they are. I think that they're separate. Sexual arousal referring to the mental and physical preparedness to engage in sex. So you can think about vaginal lubrication, for example, penile tumescence, while sexual desire, also referred to as things like sexual interest or libido or sex drive, is hypothesized to motivate individuals to engage in sexual activity. And I think that understanding this distinction is critical for several reasons. I actually wrote a chapter on this recently for the Cambridge Handbook of Evolutionary Perspectives on Sexual Psychology. Long.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, but I think the most important are that you can measure genital and subjective sexual arousal, but it's pretty difficult to measure sexual desire. And this difficulty stems from the fact that, unlike sexual arousal, there aren't concrete physiological indices of sexual desire. So a lot of the way of measuring sexual desire is self-report, which can be biased in a number of ways. That's true of a lot of different psychological measures, not just sexual desire. But sexual arousal, on the other hand, in women at least, it consists of vasocongestion, lubrication, and you can measure those things with physiological tools, which I'm happy to just go into those if you're interested. But in the lab, we have the photoplethysmograph, for example, which I can elaborate on if you'd like. Or we also have used things like Schirmer tear test strips for measuring arousal. And if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would be curious to hear you discuss some of the instruments used for measuring arousal. I guess I'm still, I don't want to say questioning because that sounds a little aggressive, but I'm questioning kind of the difference here. So it might just be a confusion on my part or misunderstanding, but.
No, there's debate about this, so you're not the only one. It's confusing for sure.
Yeah, desire it sounds like very much interior. It's very mental, unconscious, if you will. Whereas arousal is something more I'm going all straight Freudian now. Preconscious, it's like right. right, right, just below the surface, something that you can somewhat measure physiologically.
Yeah. Right. And so I think it's helpful to think about this, at least for men, right? So it gets really tricky when thinking about it for women, because sexual arousal for women is not necessarily that obvious all the time. But for men, for example, you can't have sex without being sexually aroused. You can't. You literally can't. Like you
Oh,
need
in
an
terms of men have to become erect.
correct.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
so,
yeah.
but you, men and women, I mean, you can have sex without being or having sexual desire that can then become activated once you're engaging in sex. But sexual arousal is necessary, right? Um,
You could make the same argument though for women, though. I mean, it's very difficult. It would be very difficult for a woman, and again, we're talking about heterosexual relationships at the moment.
yeah,
But in that context, I mean, if a woman is not, lubricated enough, it's going to be extremely difficult, at the very least, painful, even if the male is aroused to copulate. I mean, that's, I don't know if you could say it's necessary, but it would be, I mean, just shy of necessary. I don't know. How would you describe? I mean, would you disagree with that, or?
No, I mean, I think you raise an interesting point. I think, but I don't think it's necessary. I mean, I don't want to get into the dark side of sex, but I mean, we can think of examples all day of people not being aroused and being penetrated, for example.
Mhm.
I don't think it's necessary. I mean, but then there, also to contradict myself, just to devil advocate my own self. There are also some studies that show that people do become aroused, and even in these dark sexual experiences, to kind of protect the vagina, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's up for debate. I tend to think of them separately. One thing that I also think might be helpful, and maybe I'm just going to confuse us both more.
Go ahead.
Think about the sexual response cycles for men and women. So Masters and Johnson, came up with this kind of earlier model. It's quite linear, and I think it works pretty well for men. I don't want to butcher the stages, but I think it's something like desire, arousal, orgasm, plateau, resolution. Take that with a grain of salt. But then for women, it doesn't always happen in this linear stage. And so the model that at least clinicians, or at least in working with Cindy, that I think about the most often for women is Bassan's circular model of sexual response for women.
What is this? I'm not familiar with this.
So it is Rosemary Bassan. She developed this kind of circular model of women's sexual response, with the idea being that, unlike men, women's sexual response does not need to happen linearly, and often it doesn't. So getting back to the thing of saying earlier, you can engage in sex without having arousal, or desire rather. Desire can then be activated once you start engaging in sex. Women are receptive, so receptivity is a really big part of her circular model. And I think that that's really useful for thinking of the difference as well. And in the chapter I recently wrote, I go more into the weeds of this distinction. But
so I have, well, maybe we'll get there if you want, but I have many more questions about this. So I guess my first question is, so I'm still on the arousal versus desire. Okay, let me ask it this way. This might be a unfair question, so you can tell me if it is. Would you say both are involuntary? There's no volitional component to either, yes? Like, I can't force myself to feel desire for someone, right? And I can't force myself to be aroused. It happens.
Yeah, I mean,
tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me.
Well, okay. As somebody,
I mean, not me personally. The plural you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No. Just want to say with a grain of salt. Like, this is definitely not my primary area of.
It's okay. So,
but I mean, wow, I haven't thought about that, but I mean, you make a good point. Like, I think I don't know. I think desire is wanting sex. I think it is voluntary. I think it is this conscious desire. Like, I want to have sex right now. Great. But arousal is the physiological response. At least that's how I think about them. But yes, arousal can also happen on its own. I mean, I can't speak for this, but I have been told, or I've read things when thinking about arousal versus desire, men can become aroused for no reason. Like you accidentally like hit your pants or something, right? Like you can become aroused. And so that's not necessarily in response to sex or sexual cues. So maybe it is this kind of automatic response.
Yes, but there was a paper I just read. It was saying how in certain contexts, or rather that, here it is, I found it. So this is in a different context, but that there is exercise-induced orgasm and how that will have some associations with sleep orgasms. A study put out, Archives of Sexual Behavior, this week. And again, I don't think if people are at the gym and they're having orgasms involuntarily, I don't think that that's something that they're volitionally wanting to do. I think that the reason I bring it up is that you could, go ahead, sorry.
No, orgasms are different from arousal or desire. So we're introducing a third variable here.
Okay. So yes, that's true. Yeah, because, okay, I'd have to like pull out the whole paper and everything like that. But I guess the idea is that in some ways you could have orgasm without arousal or desire. Definitely without desire, I think.
Definitely without desire. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
which goes back to the main point, right? If sexual arousal is involuntary mostly, you could have, it's interesting. I guess you could have involuntary orgasms. That sounds weird to say out loud. And I guess you could have voluntary ones. But then there's, I guess there's this weird kind of thing in my mind of, I'm on the voluntary versus involuntary thing.
right.
How could we have, so let's start with the arousal piece for a minute. How could you have, if sexual arousal is mostly physiological and mostly involuntary, from that starting point, how could you then have potentially two types of, I guess, orgasm, or I guess multiple types of sexual experience where it's you're volitionally or there's an involuntary way of having satisfaction or pleasure or some of these subjective things and or orgasm? How could let me ask you a different way. How do you think and I'm just spitballing here, how could a involuntary thing set in motion a voluntary action that is also wrapped up in our complex physiology?
Well, so I think something to keep in mind here, and that may be the answer to your question, also spitballing, is receptivity, right? So if arousal is this involuntary thing, and then it makes sense you could have involuntary orgasm, sure, if we're following that argument. But it also makes sense that if you have involuntary arousal, noticing that then can trigger this sexual desire and more arousal, and then have this voluntary sexual experience where the orgasm follows. And at least for women, receptivity is a huge part of sexual response, or our sexuality, if you will. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. As I'm talking it out, I am seeing that there is probably, I'd have to read more about it, but I would say that yes, probably, at least for me and my brain is, okay, I could see a distinction between sexual arousal and sexual desire, but I think there's probably a lot of overlap too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that they overlap. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying, I do think of them separately, but then it gets even trickier because that's more so the women's sexuality, human sexuality, clinical kind of aspect of sexual response. But then I even get very tricked or confused myself when thinking of disgust, because disgust is this thing where, at least sexual disgust, right? Debbie Lieberman and Carlton Patrick, I believe, in their book Objection, have this beautiful model. It's chapter 6, the best chapter. I read also my second Bible, so would read that. They have this like beautiful diagram that they've made of sexual disgust. And one side of it is approach, one is avoid. And one side of the approach part is labeled lust. And then it's like, okay, so lust typically is thought of as libido or desire, but then there's all this research showing that sexual arousal inhibits sexual disgust and vice versa. There's an inhibitory relationship. So then it's like, so are we talking about arousal or desire, or are they the same? So I think it's pretty tricky to think about. But I think on average, I at least conceptually think desire is this mental piece, whereas arousal is this physical response. But it is tricky, and they have to overlap, at least to some degree. But they can still be different, right? Like not.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's overlap and they still can be different. I guess there's another way of trying to conceptualize this in terms of, can you have because I'm thinking about it in terms of a person to person kind of thing, right? One-on-one. But you could have in theory sexual desire in general, right? It's not aimed at a particular person. You could have sexual desires for a particular preference or an affinity or something like that. It seems arousal, and when I hear it, it seems more of arousal usually when it's about someone in particular. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but
yeah, I would also fight back on that, because I mean, if you think about solo sex or masturbation, arousal exists there, right? So
fair enough. Yeah, that's fair.
It doesn't have to be dyadic.
Yeah, that's fair. So okay, so I guess what about the gender differences? So you talked about the two models. So there's kind of Masters-Johnson linear model, which is one model, and you referenced the other more circular model. So what are the gender differences, I guess, between sexual arousal, desire, and then we can throw in here disgust as well. Something that you've mentioned, the sexual differences are important in how these things play out. Obviously, men and women are different, and there's similarities too, obviously, between men and women, but there are some important differences. So on this piece, how does arousal and desire and sexual disgust all kind of, play with the differences, I guess?
Yeah. So I think I kind of alluded to this, but with regards to sex differences in arousal, men notice their sexual arousal, right? Because they get erections, whereas this isn't always the case for women. And then there's also differences, which we already went down that. People are looking confused.
Well, I'm just saying, I'm not to be too critical here, but I mean, there are maybe other ways in which men can notice sexual arousal. It's not just, penile erection, right? You could notice sexual arousal in other aspects of one's body as a man than just if you have an erection or not.
To be totally fair, I am not a man, but so I would be less familiar with this, but sure, yes, I'm sure. Totally. Not trying to say that's the only way, but I would say that it is on average more noticeable when men are sexually aroused than women because of this physical response. But it's not the only one. That's an average. Maybe there are some other areas of arousal as well. I mean, this is true for women too, right? Like It's not just vaginal lubrication. It's also like people hardening or becoming flush, like men and women's skin both become flush, for example. So totally. But then also with regards to sexual arousal, there's a difference in how men and women kind of respond to sexual arousal. So one of my studies that I did was trying to replicate this Ariely paper, Ariely and Lowenstein, 2006, The Heat of the Moment. Beautiful paper, love it. That's actually, right now, there's some Twitter debate going on about this paper. But basically, we brought men and women into the lab. We randomly assigned them to control or arousal condition. We had them, fill out some just eligibility questionnaires, whatever. Then we showed them a film. If they're in the control condition, they watched nature. If they're in the arousal condition, they watched porn. And then we had them rate using the arousometer, which is this really fun device that I didn't get into the devices. So I digress.
We'll come back to it. Yes.
Yeah. So the arousal meter, which this is basically just a continuous measure of mental sexual arousal, which we didn't even get into. That's also a thing, mental sexual arousal. That's different than sexual desire. But we found in Ariely, it's a bit different than Ariely's findings, that there was actually no effect of sexual arousal on willingness to engage in these different behaviors. So date rape behaviors, for example, risky sexual behaviors, if you will. But that men who were in the arousal condition and individual differences in arousal in response to the arousal condition or being in the arousal condition, that was associated with greater willingness to engage in risk. So men, all that to say, I just said a million things, but men experience arousal differently, and that impacts their willingness to engage in different risky behaviors, at least in our study. But again, this is not the golden standard. But all that to say that men and women also respond to sexual arousal differently.
In what way?
At least in risky behavior ways. So again, this is self-report. So we can't actually measure these things, which I'm glad because they're risky behaviors. Yeah. But just in the willingness to say, hey, I would maybe slip a woman a drink to have sex with her, or a man a drink, for example. Men are more likely, at least men in the arousal condition, are more likely than women in the arousal condition to say that they would do this. It's a lot of things I just said. But with regards to sexual desire, there are also sex differences in sexual desire. So there are large and robust differences to the degree to which men and women fantasize about sex. And these differences persist across the lifespan, across relationships. But also one of the most important and kind of robust effects that I can think of is the stark difference between men and women's desire for sexual variety, where men on average are more interested in short-term relationships, more so than women, for example. And that's, a pretty big finding, Buss and Schmidt, 1993, but it's been replicated a bunch of different times. And also the number of partners that men and women desire over various time points. Men always, or at least on average, right now always, typically desire more partners than women across all of these different time points, where at least in their study, I think men desired about 18 women. And it's important to think like there was probably a bound, like if you said how many, like some might be outliers and say like 3 million, who knows? Whereas women on average just reported desiring a handful, so 4 or 5. Yes.
In terms of the differences, so I do want to go back to sexual desire versus mental arousal. Can you tell me how you understand the differences between those? Because that seems sort of confusing, and I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but it is interesting though. So how do you understand the distinction between the two?
Yeah, so I knew as soon as I said it, I was like, oh no, here we go. Okay, so I also am confused, but I think that, so there's mental sexual arousal, and then there's physiological sexual arousal. And so mental or subjective sexual arousal, at least the way we measure it in the lab, is different insofar it's recognizing how sexually aroused you are. So we ask women and men, you can use things like a film scale. So how aroused do you feel in response to this? Like how much are you experiencing tingling or pulsating or warmth, for example? We've asked women those questions. But then you can also measure physiological sexual arousal, which we also do. And the thing that's interesting is that there's highly correlated, right? If you're aroused, you probably are aware of that and you can pick up on that, and then also report mental sexual arousal, which is just, again, this kind of feeling of tingling or warmth or what have you. But again, different from desire. So
yeah, desire seems like it's the it's at the core core. It's kind of definitely. This sounds weird. Deep within us, I guess. But whereas arousal seems more higher or closer, I should say, to the surface, mental or physical, is how I'm kind of conceptualizing it.
Totally. And so, for example, some questions, if you think about desire, and I'm totally spitballing here. I haven't done one of these studies in a while, but I could imagine you would say, you can think of things like sociosexuality, which is the tendency or proclivity towards short-term mating, for example. Mm-hmm. So if you think about desire and arousal, you could say, how many partners would you desire having sex with? Are you feeling the urge to engage in sex versus, hey, how much warmth are you feeling in your genitals? Those seem different to me. And I think that they are, right? So that would be desire, the first one, and the latter being mental sexual arousal. And then physiological sexual arousal being totally different. With these, we use EKGs in the lab, we use photoplethysmography, we use penile strain gauges, although we haven't used one of those since I've been in the lab, sadly, because I think they're really cool. And then we use an arousal meter, which is this other thing. Like, we have so many different tools, but largely mapping mental sexual arousal versus physiological arousal. And then desire, I think you can assess in different ways. And a lot of evolutionary psychologists ask about the desire for, number of sexual partners, for example.
Is desire in some ways like I feel like this is still too just below the surface, but it's not want. It seems like it's more than that, I guess you could say, right? If someone says, I want to engage in this sexual act, or I want to engage in this sexual act with this person, or this, whatever it is, I think
one is enough. I think that's enough. I don't think it has to be more than that, but I would agree that when, at least thinking about it, that it would seem like it is more than that often. It's the urge, like, oh, right now, or in 10 minutes, or, but like right now I'm really experiencing, I really want to engage in this behavior, versus just on average saying, yeah, maybe in the next 4 years, I'd like to have this many sexual partners. Right. I would say that's different, but I don't think that means that it's a different construct. I think there are different ways to measure desire, just like there are different ways to measure arousal, right?
Yeah, it's weird. I see urge as more of an arousal thing. In my view, want is I don't know, a little bit more deep seated. It's but I think they're connected, right? So this is probably a silly question, but it's like, well, do I want this now because I'm aroused by it? Like, I wasn't even thinking about this, and now poof, here I am, and now I'm here, and now I want to do this. Or is it
receptivity that I keep pointing out? That's like in this situation, noticing these cues, saying, hey, I wasn't really desiring this, but I can now. Like, maybe I am receptive to this, and now I want to engage in this behavior because I'm aroused, or I'm exposed to these cues, if you will.
Yeah, it seems like there's it seems like is a part of the overlap here, where they're connecting.
I think it's also goes back to what you said, like one of your first questions just for fun was like, do you feel weird like talking about these things or thinking about this like at a dinner party? It's like, I don't think, and I think your and my like struggle in this conversation about, how are they different, really is showing us that it is very confusing. And like the average person may not know that desire and arousal are different, or fantasy, right? And so I think it's important to keep that in mind as well, as two people who have this formalized training and research. It's like maybe more confusing or less confusing to think about how these things differ. But the average person, like, would they be able to say like, hey, I'm really experiencing mental sexual arousal, but not physical sexual arousal? I'm not sure.
Right. Well, I think that the importance of some of the distinctions or delineating between some of these things is the aspect that within an evolutionary framework, it is, I think, important. But even if you put it in a clinical framework, it's important for people to be mindful or to have much larger, robust insight into the inner workings of who they are. And I think some of this stuff can be very, very helpful for people if we can understand these things. Okay, how sexual arousal and desire, we put it on a shelf that is the evolutionary framework. Okay, fine. And that has adaptive or potentially adaptive functioning utility. Fine. But then how do people translate that into, yes, but then how for me individually do I manage or navigate the distinct subjective experience or the sensations that I may have? But you can do that much better and more accurately if you have a healthy framework to understand these concepts. That's to me how I see the I guess the importance of these things. I don't know if you agree or you see it a little bit differently. Or
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I think this, and again, I'm not a clinician, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I think that far too often, I mean, people don't typically think of these experiences or different aspects of sexuality until maybe something is wrong, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a shame. I think I am a really big advocate for books like Come As You Are, which is an excellent book that, if I don't know, I didn't learn about it until it was like far too late, but really getting into the like, here are all these different experiences and let's normalize like having individual differences in a lot of different aspects involved in your sexuality. And like,
right.
I wish more people knew. So yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah. So before we go to the actual pieces of sexual disgust, we've mentioned it, so I just kind of want to, or we flagged it, so I want to come back to it, which is you've mentioned some of the instruments and how to measure arousal and disgust. Tell me a little bit about some of those, and because I think that I'll say the reason I'm asking that and the reason that's an important question, I think, is because many times people, and I think sometimes rightfully so, will discredit certain studies because, oh, this is a self-report measure. And yeah, self-report measures have some problems with them. Or, there are certain, how we understand or get at qualitative aspects or really, really challenging subjective experiences in a quantifiable way is important, right? This is why there's a very small subset of people in research that really focus on normative studies and how we do certain types of test construction. And because if you're not able to get at something accurately, people are going to make very strong claims and sometimes spurious claims off of faulty instruments or faulty tests. And, that definitely puts a question mark on how strongly we can hang our hat on something. So again, all instruments or all measures are going to have strengths and weaknesses, but maybe just explain some of the instruments you use and how you're able to accurately get some of the kind of subjective experiences or sensations.
Yeah, totally. This is, I think, the coolest part of being a part of Cindy's lab, or Cindy Meston, are the tools. I think it's so cool. I learned about them as an undergrad, and I'm still like, gave a tour to some research assistants yesterday. I was like, here are all the tools. Like, so I think, yeah, every measure has its limitations, right? Some are more accurate than others. With at least sexual disgust, I'll just go into that one first. I will say that a majority of at least the research that I'm aware of is self-report on at least individual differences in sexual disgust. But you can also, I haven't done this, but some people, you can manipulate disgust, which I think is really interesting. That's not necessarily measuring it, but you can measure how manipulating disgust impacts other things. So there's something called liquid ass, which is very funny, but it's just farts array, basically. Sometimes Leith has done research with that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that's one thing. And then, other things like people have left like a fake little like thing that looks like feces on a keyboard, or left sweaty clothes in the room or something like that. Mm-hmm. But the most typical way of measuring disgust is by these self-report measures. unfortunately, I wish there was a better way to measure sexual disgust, because that would be super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But then when it comes to arousal and desire, this is where we have these really fun, cool tools. So lots of different tools. Some I don't know as much about, but in our lab, at least, desire is typically also a self-report questionnaire. I talked about that earlier. But then with arousal, we have so many cool things. So we have the arousometer, or arousal meter, and that's this continuous measure. So it's a computer mouse that's mounted onto a wooden box that participants place their hand on and move continuously out the presentation of a film based on how mentally sexually aroused they're feeling. So we have 0, which is no mental sexual arousal, all the way to 7. And we use that. I used that in my arousal paper I was talking about earlier, trying to replicate some of Ariely's work. But then we have the physiological indices. So we use EKG. One of my lab mates is studying heart rate variability with like a heart rate strap during sex, which is a really cool study. I'm very excited to see. But then the two that I think are the most probably well known, if you will, is the photoplethysmograph. And so that's for women. And the way that that works, it's basically an acrylic shaped tampon with a little black square that emits light. And what we do is when we have women come into the lab, we have them insert it with a black square facing up towards their navel, and it reflects light. So when women get more physiologically aroused, more blood flows into the vaginal walls, and this light reflects more based on how aroused she is. So more blood flow, more light is reflected, and you get this change in amplitude in different like wavelengths. It's called vaginal pulse amplitude. And one way that we try to control this as much as possible is when we have women in the lab using these devices, we measure a baseline. This goes for EKG as well, in response to, there's like a relaxed screen, but then also in response to 3 minutes of just nature film before showing them arousal film. And then we calculate the change in vaginal pulse amplitude, or EKG waves. And then for men, we have the penile strain gauge, which I mentioned earlier, we have not used since I have been in the lab. I was an RA in the lab, so it's been a really long time. But this I would like to use somehow. But it's this really cool device that basically is a loop, right? A copper wire that men place around the base of the penis. And as they become more aroused, more strain is placed onto this wire. And so you measure the difference in the amount of strain. And there are different sizes. So, you know, men don't have to get offended. We have different sizes for men. And we also would get a baseline measure for that, if that makes sense.
Obviously I know we both know this, but just for listeners, there is a whole section in the APA Code of Ethics about research to be done ethically. So if some people are kind of squirming in their chair or wherever, and they're just like, this sounds really intrusive here, there is extremely stringent ethical guidelines on how to conduct research in ethical ways for the make sure that participants aren't harmed. So obviously, any of this stuff has to go through IRB and all that fun process.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I mean, UT, at least in our lab, like we go through really, really strict protocols to get these studies approved and, you know, make sure they're not coercive to people, for example. Right. But a lot of people also like want to participate in sex research. So it's works out. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess let's move into, it's very interesting, to sexual disgust specifically now. I guess we could probably talk about, you wrote a paper about the 6 dimensions of disgust and how you explain about sexual disgust. And so maybe we can start with that and then branch out with some of the other pieces as well. But I guess one of the things that, you know, so we've talked about evolution, we've talked about sexual selection, we've talked about what sex is and isn't, we've talked about disgust and what it is and what it isn't, arousal, desire, etc. So now maybe just finally we can get to the idea of, or the construct of sexual disgust. And so maybe just kind of give us the broad overview, and then we can start, you know, chipping away at some of the particulars.
Totally. So I think of sexual disgust as first described, at least within an evolutionary framework, by Tiber and colleagues again, 2009. Really great paper, just gonna keep saying it. But yeah, so basically it's this emotion that functions to help individuals avoid costly sexual partners, situations, or behaviors that may pose a risk. And unlike pathogen disgust, there is this kind of pathogen risk to some of these behaviors, right? But it is not always this pathogen risk that we're talking about in terms of cost. So things like reputational damage, for example, which we got into earlier, pathogen threat, sure. And then also, I mean, you can think about things like unrequited romantic interest, for example, like channeling resources unnecessarily. They're just really like costly sexual behaviors or behaviors channeled towards getting a mate or securing a mate or having sex.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of a broad definition, it is very broad, but I guess another way of kind of, branching out from this is it seems that sexual disgust in particular does manifest or present differently with males and females. Is this correct or no?
Yes. So there are large and robust sex differences with like Cohen's D's ranging from like 0.5 to 1.5. For listeners, Cohen's D's are effect sizes, and those are quite large for psychological research. Mm-hmm. And so this is huge. This has been replicated countless times using different measures. So it's not just like one study. But yeah, totally. Women have higher levels of sexual disgust on average than men. And this is really important to keep in mind. I think this makes sense if you do think about it in terms of evolutionary theory. Women face more cost than men with sex, right? So parental investment theory, basically, like women have to carry offspring for a minimum of 9 months. Men do not. So want to make sure that you are not having sex indiscriminately, basically. Although if you do, there are also some women who do, that's totally fine. I'm not saying that's bad, but and then also like women, so if you think about STI risk, this is really interesting. I learned this in graduate school. I didn't know this. Women are not only more susceptible to STIs because of the climate of the vagina. So it's a moist place. It's warm, right? So, but they also incur greater damage from STIs when they contract them, such as sterility, for example.
Yeah.
And so because of these cost discrepancies on a lot of different aspects of our evolved sexual psychology, I think this plays out in seeing differences in disgust responses between men and women.
In terms of the kind of, we can get to the 6 dimensions in a minute, but I guess in terms of I might be getting ahead of myself here, but how does it, I mean, again, this is a very individualized thing, but since there has been so much research done on the differences between males and females, I think that's important to note because it's going to, on average, present a little differently. Mm-hmm. How does it usually manifest in terms of the sexual disgust? Is this, since you use females, are females not putting themselves in certain situations? Are they declining certain advances? Or is it just more of an internal thing where, this is probably a little bit harder to kind of understand, but I guess my main question is how does this express itself or manifest itself? The males and females have a type of sexual disgust. Okay, I don't want to do this, or this is something that's off-putting, or that's potentially harmful. Right. How does it, I guess, present for males and females?
Yeah, so I think, that's a great question. I think that basically on average, when I'm talking about, and other researchers are talking about the sex difference, it's mostly in trait disgust, which is different than state, which just broadly, state disgust is the state you're in. Are you disgusted by a specific stimuli in a given situation, whereas trait disgust is long-term proclivities towards disgust or, pathogen avoidance. And so I think that that's really important to keep in mind because trait disgust, women and men are different. There are these different thresholds. But I also think that it does become activated in different ways. I don't think there's that much research on that, but one thing that comes to mind, which I alluded to earlier, is if you, for example, induce sexual arousal, then men and women's disgust responses are inhibited. But the degree to which, if I recall correctly, is even greater for women. And then the vice versa is true as well. So if you induce disgust using liquid ass or whatever, then arousal is inhibited too. So there are differences in response to these specific experimental manipulations, but then also just on average in response to questionnaires, if you will.
Do you think that there is an element here where, so obviously you're talking about state versus trait disgust, but what is the components of overlap between sexual disgust and kind of your basic core disgust, pathogen avoidance? So let me spell this out a little bit. Not trying to be too graphic intentionally, but just to illustrate the point, when people are sexually intimate in any way, there is going to be an exchange of fluids. And so if people are interacting sexually, either orally, anally, and or with one's genitals, and I mean, there's going to be potentially saliva, semen, blood, potentially, etc., and just many of the ways in which the human body secretes various compounds and liquids. How does the sexual? So I guess my question is, because of those features, that would seem to me to be that there's another overlap between, yeah, that's a kind of pathogen that, or potentially could be perceived that way. Is there an overlap between the core element of disgust in the system and then sexual disgust? Another way of asking that is, oh, yeah, that's off-putting to me. I don't want that, around me or in me or whatever. And that is sometimes leading the now sexual disgust. And then you could map that further on. There are maybe some people that maybe they have a bad experience, and so there are a series of bad experiences and or trauma that can contribute to chronic or trait disgust. So I guess what's the overlap and how does that kind of function if you know it all?
Yeah, so I think, this gets to something that I thought about and may have tried to say earlier, but not so clear. I think that an element of sexual disgust is certainly pathogen disgust. I think they do overlap. I think it's pathogen disgust in response to these sexual cues or situations or, bodily fluids. But I think that's fine. They can overlap. Maybe they're highly correlated, right? But it's in response to sexual situations. But what I think is really unique to sexual disgust is that it is also elicited in response to, again, these things that may not pose obvious pathogen threats. So getting back to, reputation damage or status or something like that. At least in some of our measures, there are items that aren't necessarily tied to pathogens, such as BDSM behaviors. However, people nominate these things as things they're disgusted by. And so I think it overlaps with pathogen disgust, but is not only pathogen disgust in response to sexual situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. So tell me about the 6 dimensions. There's a paper you wrote. The 6 were BDSM, oral, promiscuity, same-sex relations. Am I right on this? Or are those the 6 dimensions?
Yeah, so taboo, oral sex, promiscuity, hygiene, BDSM, and same-sex attraction. This is really interesting. This is my first graduate project, which was really fun, and I learned a lot. But basically what we did was noticed from Tiber's model and some of Haidt's earlier work, right, the idea of sex and sexual disgust, and thinking about how important sexually reproducing is, which we talked about earlier. Because sexually reproducing, finding a mate, is one of the most important adaptive problems. We were just kind of curious about if sexual disgust was more than what is included on previous measures. So Tiber's model, I think or Tiber et al., not just Tiber, but I think there are 7 items about sexual disgust. Some of them being things like, a stranger touching your thigh in an elevator. That's one of the items. And so we were just curious, like we looked at this and said, these do certainly elicit sexual disgust, but is there more? And so one thing that my advisor, David Buss, is quite popular for is ACT nominations, which basically you ask individuals what they think about a certain term or phrase, and you don't define anything because you don't want to impose some like lexical kind of definition. And then from that, you get a giant list of behaviors. You can reduce them down to, the top X amount, give those to people, do factor analyses. So we did this for sexual disgust. So we asked individuals to nominate things that elicited or they thought was sexually disgusting without, again, defining this. And from that, we got about 2,300 nominations, which were quite interesting to comb through, I must say.
2,300 items?
Yeah, 23 items, 2,300 different items or acts or behaviors. After reducing those down to things that were basically the same. So, for example, someone may have nominated anal sex versus butt sex. So you go through, you comb them through, you combine them. We took the top 50 most frequently nominated items. After the top 50, the items started to largely overlap. So that's why we chose 50. And then we gave those to a new group of participants. We asked them to rate how disgusting these items were. And then we did this statistical analysis called a factor analysis, which allows you to look at how items cluster together in multiple domains to explain more statistical variance. And we found these 6 different factors. And then we looked at things like sex differences, how does this relate to personality, for example, religiosity, and just briefly, oral sex obviously includes oral sex, so on a man or a woman. Taboo includes items that, such as bestiality, incest, rape, for example. Promiscuity is largely like group sex, threesomes, having sex in public, watching pornography, which I thought was really interesting. A lot of people nominated that. Hygiene, which is, I think, really tapping into this kind of pathogen aspect that we talked about, which is having sex with somebody who has bad breath, for example, which could be an obvious pathogen threat. BDSM, just different behaviors involved in that, such as whipping or spanking people or choking, with consent, right? And then same-sex attraction, which is male and female homosexuality.
Okay, I have many questions.
Yeah, go for it.
The first question I have is a technical one.
Yes.
So I've not done factor analyses personally. It's hard stats to do. I definitely know what it is, but
they're so fun. Love them.
Yeah, they're cool, especially for this kind of stuff. So, you explained it right. You're trying to get at the underlying variable between all these other different variables.
Yeah.
And so the loading of the variables becomes super important. Mm-hmm. Typically, right? Am I right on this? It's usually whatever the first couple of ones that you load in first usually come back pretty large.
Yeah. So
not always, but.
No, totally. Yeah. And so so there are a lot of different methods of factor analysis, but the one that we did and what's typically done when developing a scale is you first do exploratory factor analysis if you have no kind of underlying idea of how these things might emerge. From that, you get these factors and then you reduce the items based on some, arbitrary cutoff threshold. So I think we did 0.3 or 0.5, which is pretty standard. Just being that the higher they load, the more this factor is like represented by these items. So if you have something that loads pretty low, then it's probably actually not that important for that factor. And then what you do is then administer all of the items that you retain to a new sample and then do confirmatory factor analysis where you specify the number of factors and then there's a specific like model fit indice that you have to reach. And if you do, then, you know, it's kind of great, that's good, here's a measure. But then you have to validate it by relating it to other things that, you know, would at least or have been related to in the past for some more supportive of that, but then also things that you would predict to be different, which is what we did as well.
Yeah, and when you're, I can't remember if it's in the exploratory or if it's in the second half, but usually they will spit out certain types of eigenvalues, which are certain things that will be able to tell you, you know, a certain number here. But again, just for listeners, the point of doing this is that when you have so many variables, you can't just do regression analysis or multiple regression analysis. There's too many things, there's too many variables, and you want to be able to say, how does one connect with the other? Again, not causality, but how do they correlate? And when you're trying to factor in certain things and factor out other things. So, right, is this one thing contributing to this? And, you know, are all these other things connected to that, right? Or are they not, right? So what is the impact of gender and, you know, age and SES and religion and whatever variables you want to know? How are these things impacting certain variables, or are the variables connected with each other? And so when you have so many, this is what they do with IQ testing, is, okay, how do we do this? How do we get the underlying variables here, and we distill it down? And so when you're taking something like 2,300 items and then you're trying to get it down to 50, and then you get down finally to these 6 dimensions, it can be very helpful in, I mean, really just distilling kind of the essence, if you will, of what you're trying to, your independent variables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally. And I think you make a really good point, and I just want to kind of expand upon that if I can. A really big thing to keep in mind too is with statistics, the more tests you run, the more likely you are to get spurious significance or, you know, results. And so a really good point of using factor analysis and tools such as this is that by having these different dimensions, then you can look at how, you know, exactly what you said, like personality or religion are associated with each factor versus 50 items or 30 items. Right. You do less tests, you're less likely to get spurious significance, you have more power, etc.
Right. Yeah. So that's great. So you did it. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to do it for this study. And so you get these 6 dimensions. And so how do these dimensions, so when you were talking about this, I was thinking about some of the implications here of I don't want to say religion, but a type of Puritan kind of mindset a little bit. You know, if you did this study in, you know, Uganda, or if you did this study in France, if you did this study in, you know, Canada, you know, if you do it in different places, parts of the world, right, you would probably get, you know, I would imagine you would get some maybe different results, maybe not, but any idea as to why some of these things did load or how you were able to classify them, I guess, as a dimension, and was that surprising? And can you understand whether it's religion or culture or whatever that is impacting, or how confidently are you willing to state some of that?
Yeah, so I think we didn't just do this in Texas because that's obviously would be restricted or a limitation. Yeah. We did this largely online using Mechanical Turk. And we did have some of students nominate this, but we made sure first of all, this paper has 3 different studies. So we did lots of things to make sure that we were, you know, trying, hedging our bets a little, if you will, by testing it multiple times. I think if you asked or did an ACT nomination procedure in different places, you might get different behaviors. But honestly, the behaviors that are at least on the final measure are behaviors that a lot of people nominated. Like, these are the most frequently nominated ones. And yeah, so maybe the items will be different. I wasn't necessarily surprised though by the items we found, because a lot of these things like incest or bestiality, these
Sure.
are huge.
Sure.
They represent huge adaptive problems, right? And so I think regardless of where you go for the items that, and I would say most of them have some adaptive value, such that they pose a huge adaptive problem if you engage in these things, right? I think you would see those nominated regardless of where you're asking people. But when you get down to the more specifics, then yeah, maybe that's not something you would get in Uganda or elsewhere. However, the top 50 items that we picked were items that exist everywhere. That's all I'll say. And then the further you got down the list were more specific things that I had to like quite literally Urban Dictionary them. Like this funny like process of sitting in like David and Cindy's office and being like, what is this term? And like we're Googling it, I'm reading it, like the doors open. Like again, I'm not sure how I haven't been banned from YouTube, but yeah, but I think what to speak to that too, we haven't published this. I've been working on this paper for a while, but I have done some work on this, and hopefully it'll be a paper soon. But we have tested this cross-culturally as well, because I do think that it's really important to test it outside of the US, right? And so we have so far data from, I think, 9 different places. So we have the US, we have Kenya, El Salvador, Kazakhstan, which, sorry if I mispronounced that, Ukraine, Russia, for example. So all of these different places, and we're testing at least primarily the factor structure. So is it a good fit in these different places, but also sex differences. So we're looking for consistent sex differences, with the idea being that because there are sex differences in sexual disgust, these things, the items included and subsumed by our measure, do have these really stark adaptive differences for men and women, that we should see evidence of universal sex differences towards these factors. And we do find that basically wherever men or women are, their average disgust responses towards the 31 items are correlated with the average disgust responses of men and women, and everywhere else that we have data at like 0.9. So this is saying like people are really, really agreeing on how disgusting these different behaviors are, which I think is important, because if they didn't, then it's like, yeah, are there these cultural differences? Are there elements that we need to think about when, conducting analyses or thinking about disgust in general?
My immediate kind of reactionary response to that is, I would be fascinated to just get the anthropologist in here and say, well, what do we make of this? You're seeing this across cultures and different countries, different continents. And, we're, 0.9 is pretty high. I mean, it's like, what can we understand about that? And some of the, kind of forces at play there in terms of, when things are that way across culturally so strongly, my maybe faulty heuristic is that something about us as something about us as humans? Is that something about human nature? At the very least, modern human nature. Let's say that modern meaning, past, a couple thousand years or whatever. That's where my mind goes with it, but I could be totally wrong. But that is super fascinating. Any ideas about what that could be? Or
yeah, I mean, I think when we see evidence of people agreeing across the globe on different things, I mean, granted, we only have data from 9 places, so I'm not saying across the whole.
Sure.
I would love to get data from every single place. So stay tuned. Maybe that's my career goal. Who knows?
It's super hard. Yeah.
It's a big goal. But yeah, I think something that's really important, though, is if you do see agreement across the world in different places, I think that or evidence of universality, for example, I think that does really tell us something about at least, the modern species or evolution, right? But I think more critically, these things are probably, right, showcasing some evidence of the adaptive relevance. Like why would we have universality and agreeing towards disgust, or mate preferences, for example, which is like not my research, but David's done a lot of work on that around the world. And it's like, well, because these things are tied to really important adaptive problems. Like it's really critical not to have sex with people who may pose risk to you. It's really important to find a partner who, not will at least return your interest and invest in you. And so I think that universality and testing this around the world does show us that at least modernly, but I think even further than that in our evolutionary history, this emotion and these, dimensions really do represent some bigger kind of solution to adaptive problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it shows again just how much there's a connection within our evolutionary tree, but also shows, I think, some of the aspects of, the more things you uncover, the more we understand, or we have better understanding, I guess, of, how complicated and complex we are as humans. And so I think, kind of like what you had just said, that, to keep expanding that and seeing it in other places, aside from the 9 countries, would be, super important. So in terms of sexual disgust, I mean, we've talked about, kind of defined it and talked about how it presents. I guess the 2 pieces here I want to just ask about is, it seems like obviously there's sexual disgust for, incest, bestiality, things that you've mentioned. But it seems that STIs, so sexually transmitted infections, are probably a primary or big one. And probably, again, some of that overlap with the pathogen basic disgust. Is there anything specifically that you want to discuss or state about the whether it's the differences or just kind of the presentation of sexual disgust with avoiding STIs, things like that?
Yeah, actually, this is something that I should have said earlier. To my surprise, none of that came up whenever, at least with like the top 50 items. So on our measure of sexual disgust, which is 31 items, 6 factors, there are no items about STIs. And so I don't know if it's, I certainly think that that's, at least thinking about like my own modern dating life, like definitely a concern. But yeah, it's not on our measure. It's not included on previous measures. So I find that pretty interesting and shocking. But in my dissertation work, I did include some questions about having sex, for example, with somebody who maybe has HIV and who hasn't disclosed that, or has HIV and has disclosed it, and you use protection, and just kind of varying degrees of that, because I am interested in at least how that might differ between men and women. I mean, especially because I mentioned earlier, women are more susceptible to STIs and can suffer a lot of damage from them. But yeah, I don't know why it is that people didn't nominate that, at least reliably. I was quite shocked by that. There are also some things that are included on that final measure that I think we would like to add and test as well, just because, like I said earlier, this is not the end all be all. This is definitely just another dive into what sexual disgust is. And I think that there are a lot of different behaviors that could be added to this measure that do pose some costs that aren't on here. Like period sex, for example, too, is not on here.
Right. I wonder, this is speculative, but I wonder if it's because in many ways, many of the STIs are, at least in the Western world, treatable, not all. And I think if you catch it pretty early, or if you use preventative measures or proactive measures, that it can definitely minimize. Again, not all. And I wonder if there's some element of that. It's not like we don't know what this is. What is this? Oh my goodness. And we don't have anything to treat it. We know what a lot of these things are. We have an okay understanding of them, and we can have some ways of treating them.
Yep.
There are vaccines for some of them, et cetera, medications for some, so I think that that's purely speculative on my part, but I wonder if there's a component of that.
I wonder that too. And I'm still shocked by that, and I should have mentioned that earlier. But I also think that this another explanation for that maybe because I really think that that also taps into some sort of morality piece, right? Mm-hmm. So especially if you're not conveying that maybe you have an STI, and that may be why people didn't nominate it as discussed, or maybe it's because it's something that people wouldn't even consider. So maybe they don't list it as that because it's not something that they think of whenever thinking of sex. I'm not sure. And I think it is certainly a limitation of the measure.
Yeah. Well, that leads to the last point that I wanted to ask about. So we've been talking about the multi-dimensional aspect of disgust, and we talked about the core disgust, we talked about sexual disgust, and one of the other ones is moral disgust. And so again, right, you can tease these out and look at these various dimensions, if you will, of disgust, but they all have some sort of overlap, right? And as you're mentioning the morality piece of it with the sexual disgust, that we could maybe just tell us, just kind of the brief definition of what moral disgust is. I know this isn't particularly your area, but just tell us, kind of the definition of moral disgust and how it's a little bit different. And then maybe we can talk a little just briefly about the overlap with sexual disgust.
Yeah, so moral disgust is disgust towards social transgression. So things like lying, stealing, or cheating that may pose cost or harm to you or your social group. And it's been researched. Tiber is, one of the, again, these Tiber et al. Are definitely the ones who have drawn kind of the most attention to this, besides Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations, but that's not considering it as a disgust. But I think mostly the most helpful way to think about it is just what things violate social norms, stealing again. And there is some debate about if moral disgust is just anger, for example. But there's some work that's basically showed that when moral violations are against yourself, you as an individual, anger is elicited. But when moral violations are towards others, then disgust is really activated. And I think that somehow people are kind of aware of this. I mean, if you think about, not to get political, but like Donald Trump used the word disgust like all of the time. And I think like maybe this is kind of showing us like, oh, let's be disgusted at this group because they're wrong. They're, harming us or posing cost. And so I think that is certainly what moral disgust is. I do think it's less obvious to me, at least, as it is related to disgust, but I also think, I know less about this area. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important because, the social norm, I mean, it's complicated, right? And this to me is if you take it as a type of dimensionality of disgust, the moral component is the one that does map on or interact a little bit more with the social emotions, if you will. And, that violation of social norms is just so, social norms are different every 2 or 3 generations, different in some parts of the world. And so it's interesting to think about this. I would imagine, I don't know the literature too strongly on this, of any universality of this, because, you can make the philosophical argument of, well, are there universal morals? And, that's a whole other discussion, but, but either way, I think it can be very, very challenging. But kind of tying it in, how do you see the overlap with, sexual disgust, where people will say that or seem or appear to think about these ideas of, well, that's immoral to, or incorrect, or things like that, with some of these things.
Totally. So this is a question again that really I've been thinking about. What's the difference between sexual disgust and sexual morality, for example, at least moral judgments towards sex?
Sure. Yeah.
I do think they're different. I think that they largely probably overlap. And just getting back to your point about social norms, the Lieberman and Carlton book, Objection, which I've mentioned before, I think is a really good book for reading about the morality, kind of, how it manifests, why we have it, moral disgust. Do a really beautiful job describing that. I think what's really interesting is, and I'm digressing a little, but if you think of laws, for example, a lot of laws exist around the world, right? So why do we have, and maybe not in small scale societies, but I'm saying mostly, at least like westernized places, like there are laws against, stealing or
murder,
incest or bestiality. Right. And it's like, why? Well, because people engage in these behaviors. So it's like, we are trying to at least advance some sort of morality or moral judgment and say, this is wrong, you shouldn't do this. So I think that it largely probably overlaps with regards to morality and sexual disgust. And you can even think about, so Jonathan Haidt has this example that is, Julie and Mark, they're two siblings. They go on this island. They agree to have sex with one another just once, just to see what it's like. They use condoms. She's on birth control. There's no way they get pregnant. Neither of them has regret after they have sex. They never tell anyone. And if you ask people, what do you think about this? People will say, oh, it's wrong, it's disgusting. And they can't explain why. And he calls it moral dumbfounding. But that is an example of a sexual situation. So to me, it's like, oh, is that morality? Is it disgust? Are they the same? So I think they overlap. And I am not clear how different they are, but I do think they're different. So I'm trying to investigate that a little bit in my dissertation too. But yeah, that's like a roundabout answer because I'm not sure.
No, it is hard. And I think kind of when we were discussing earlier about this, trying to make this delineation between arousal and desire, sort of the kind of, I guess you could say philosophical and more specifically phenomenological argument is we're trying to understand, we're trying to differentiate different types of discrete subjective experiences that people have, and how do we have a appropriate taxonomy for understanding common subjective experiences. And what we find in trying to do this accurately is that there's a lot of overlap and it is very difficult. And I think sometimes it's not a language thing, but it sort of kind of is, where it's like we just don't know what to call this thing. And it's so much like something else, and it's very difficult. I had this conversation with Jess Tracy about, we were talking about pride, and we, towards the end of that conversation, we talked about some of the taxonomy of some of the quote unquote positive emotions, and that compassion and empathy and I forget, there's a few other ones. We can kind of just see them as umbrella. There's one umbrella to gratitude. We can see the umbrella term, and then all these other ones that are a little different, and they do get at something, but they all kind of fit under that umbrella idea. And I think this idea of moral, something being immoral or something being some element of disgust, I think is kind of like that in some ways. Is how do we just figure out what is that appropriate kind of categorization?
Totally. I think it's so hard though, because then it's also like, is disgust, which I have this idea about, is disgust for other people and morality is for yourself? But I don't know. I get confused by the two as well. I mean, I think I can see both, and the adaptive relevance, I think they both certainly exist, but it's, how much do they overlap? How different are they? are they elicited differently? Are the behavioral outputs differently, or different rather? Disgust is avoidance. Like, what is morality? Is that also avoidance? I certainly know less about morality, and I'm trying to learn more about it, but yeah, it's confusing.
Yeah, I would say that it is confusing and it's very difficult, and but I think that that's folks like yourself keep trying to investigate and try to do good research and figure some of this stuff out.
Totally. I want to say one last thing about that.
Please.
But
yeah, please.
I think something that's important to keep in mind too is you're describing how do we label these things? It's confusing and difficult. I also think something that is important to keep in mind that even complicates us even more is we don't need to even be aware of psychological processes or anything. So there might even be things that we have no idea are going on that could be solving some sort of adaptive problem that we may not even be aware of, right? Like the brain is this kind of black box that all of these things are getting calculated in. And I think it's really interesting. Like, we don't need a conscious awareness of behavioral processes. I don't know, which complicates more, but
I would agree that there are, that does start to get into this kind of philosophy of science, if you will, which is great. I love that stuff. Most people don't, because it gets really abstract and it's just so far. But I think what you're saying is right. I think that there are many things that we don't necessarily need to always understand some of these processes, but there's some things that we are going to uncover and realize that it's very hard to try and categorize it. And I totally agree with you there. Well, Courtney, it's been so much fun talking to you for almost 3 hours. You're super generous with your time and your energy and your brilliance. Anything else that you want to say? Where can people find you? Either your research or online. Anything else that you want to add in here?
Yeah, I mean, the pleasure's been all mine. I'm this young, starry-eyed grad student, so it's been really fun. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, my website is CourtneyCrosby.com, and that has links to all of my other stuff, including my research and Twitter and all the things. Yeah, I going into my 5th year of graduate school, so who knows where I'll be, but it's been super fun. Looking forward to what's to come for sure.
No, that's fantastic, and you're doing great work. So I will definitely support all the work you're doing, and I think you'll be just fine out in the world once you're all finished very, very, very soon. So again, thanks a bunch for coming on and sharing really important research that you've been doing.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.